Is it recording?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. All right, so I'm studying for my thesis proposal. My name is Kim McCullen. The role of psychosocial interventions and supports offered to the whole family system and how that interacts with the childhood cancer community. So each year there's 16,000 kids in the U.S. alone diagnosed with childhood cancer, and around anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 that will pass away from a pediatric cancer. And pediatric or childhood cancers are very different than adult cancers because there's not an obvious symptom or diagnosis. There's no sometimes there's environmental causes, but not in the sense of preventative measures. Like there's a connection to smoking and lung cancer, or there are proven connections that would cause breast cancer, but there's not any correlation like that with many of the childhood cancers. So because of this, it needs to be studied very differently and treated very differently than adult cancers. But unfortunately, you'll see that's not always the case. And so then to just break down the statistics, that's 1 in 285 children in the United States, and each day 46 children will be diagnosed, which is 2 classrooms if you think about it. So even though it's known as a rare disease, it's really not as rare as you would think it is. So in order to understand also the stress that families go under, I think it's important to understand that there's 18 very common childhood cancers and then a few other smaller, less common ones. But out of the 18, I think it's important to note that half of them have less than a 50% chance of survival for a 5-year rate. And just to explain the 5-year rate, they use this so that any children 5 years post-diagnosis that are still living, that could mean they're still on treatment, battling cancer, they're off treatment but still have cancer, or they're cancer-free. So what this really doesn't take into account are all the people or children who pass away after 5 years, which for many of the low-grade brain tumors, which are up here, actually have between 8 to 10 years after diagnosis tend to regrow and usually results in fatalities, along with a couple others like neuroblastoma, which already has a very low survival rate. If you relapse with that after your 5-year date, there's 0 chance of survival. And then along with some of the other ones is ATRT, who Ariana in the slide before passed away from, and DIPG, which is a form of brain tumor. None of those actually, it's very difficult to find a case of a child who survives that type of cancer within 10 years. So even some of those numbers are skewed. So you can imagine if you're a parent or siblings or the child themselves know that these numbers are out there, it's just important to take into account that so emotionally and psychologically, you have that on your mind the whole time, that it's not necessarily the best outlook. However, that number is often skewed or not realized because a lot of the information that's most commonly put out there is that overall cancer survival rates have increased from 1980s, which was 55%, to now about 80%. However, as you saw on the previous slide, a lot of that was ALL leukemia is very 90% survival rate. So those numbers are really kind of skew that up. And then because it's good that obviously the children are surviving at a higher instance, but that's due to more intense treatments and more radical treatments, which then result in 2 out of 3 of these children having secondary or having severe symptoms such as secondary cancers. So for example, I know 2 kids who were when I met them, they were cancer-free, but then years later, they either became diagnosed with a cancer as a direct result of the treatment for their first cancer, which then is often fatal as well, because once a child has gone through 1 round of cancer treatment and survival, it's very difficult to do that a second time. There's also infertility and organ damage that just can lead to chronic life problems. So even for survivors and kids who are cancer-free, they still desperately need some, along with potentially medical support, also some emotional and social support, especially when it comes to the impaired cognition and stunted growth. So you might have a 16-year-old who's in high school but looks like she's 8 or 9. So that's going to have severe psychological effects on someone. Or the opposite, where you have someone who is 18 and they look 18, but they're processing at more of a 5-6-year-old level. So there's definitely, even with the survival, needed supports And so then also it's important to note that in the last 20 years, only 2 new drugs have been approved specifically for children, and that 50% of the chemotherapies used right now were diagnosed over 25 years ago. So they're still targeting adult treatments rather than childhood treatments. And that's why I wasn't sure about an image, but we can talk about that after. So because of these alarming statistics of the different issues that come along with kids who are surviving, Armstrong and Raymond in 2005 who work for the National Cancer Institute, released a support advocating that all childhood research funding becomes allocated strictly for medical purposes of different treatments or different cures, and not put anything else to any other support systems, just solely on the science. And the problem with this is that our pediatric cancers are drastically underfunded as it is. The National Cancer Institute that they work for give only 4% of their entire research funding to children. And then the American Cancer Society, which sort of covers up their statistic, it's less than 1% that goes to them, but that's where commonly like Relay for Life is really a popular thing. American Cancer Society has another really popular fundraising, and they actually use children as a majority of their advertisements, which is very ironic considering less than 1% is actually going to kids. So this is the result of that, is that the government funds almost no psychological treatment research for kids and families, and so services have to come from outside sources. But as you'll see, these services are desperately needed. So the social and emotional stress that goes to all family members has been studied pretty intensely now. One of the most in-depth studies that I came across was by Patterson, Holm, and Gurney in 2004. They studied over 186 families for over a 2-year period, and they found that there was a severe loss of normal life. There was parental disputes and discrepancies. Siblings had severe emotional distress or added behavior, behavioral issues in school, as well as the patient themselves. There was also, they also found severe PTSD lasting in many families, so that's post-traumatic stress, and PTSS, which are post-traumatic stress symptoms. So whether or not the child passed away or is cancer-free, even up to 5 years later, because all of these kids actually were off treatment for a year, so at least 1 year later and up to 5 years later, they still found that there was a lot of psychological distress and PTSD symptoms that resulted from the initial cancer diagnosis. And then another study that I found was very interesting and really summarized a lot of the issues that come with the lack of funding for psychosocial services was done by Litzelman, Katrine, Gagnon, and Witt in 2011. And they found that caregivers, it's sort of like a vicious cycle that goes on, because the caregivers, which in most cases is the parents, holds the heaviest burden. But then the burden that the parents have, their stress shows and reflects onto the children. So then the children become stressed seeing that their parents are stressed, which stresses the parents out increasingly because they're seeing their kids are becoming increasingly stressed, and then that cycle continues on and on. So that's why there's a need for psychosocial interventions, which consist of many different forms of that. The most common are probably private, personal, or group family therapy. So that would be where you sit down with a counselor and you talk about your problems. They'll help connect you with other services you might need, and it's just like a safe place to sort of talk and prioritize what each individual family or person, if it's a solo psychological therapy session. But also there's different forms in the hospital themselves. There's child life specialists, which help to alleviate the stress and anxiety that come around different procedures. They'll talk children through any procedures, and they'll educate the families, and again interact with siblings and parents to try and just bring the stress level of as a whole down, so that overall the family functions as a unit, so that by helping one person, you're helping everyone. There's also online support groups, which are growing more popular, which, especially with the childhood cancer community, if it is spread out around the country or even the world, and for some of the rarer cancers, it's a way that families who might not be able to communicate with other people are able to reach out, as well as in-person support groups. And then I have a source that I haven't narrowed down yet, but basically it'll be, again, reiterating the fact that anytime that there's psychological or psychosocial interventions paired with an initial cancer diagnosis treatment plan, that the stress levels of the families are decreased lower than if there wasn't. And then, so Ann Kazak, who is the director of the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, she's a behavioral specialist as well as working on other, as well as working for the last 30 years studying solely psychosocial intervention with childhood cancer. She found that in 2015, so it was very updated, she even mentions in her opening paragraph that she's really wrapping up everything she's studied in her over the last 3 decades, the 7 ways that that psychosocial interventions most easily help to provide support to families. And it was mostly found that managing different pain symptoms, as well as just the psychological effects, and the most thing that she emphasized was the social ecology. So they're helping kids in school, at home, in the hospital, with friends, and that takes into account like any different microsystem, which are some of the things I just listed. Any of those things that are greatly affected, they try and find ways to minimize a cancer diagnosis effect on those systems to really increase the quality of life and sense of normalcy for all members of the family. And then they also help to facilitate transitions. So there's a lot of different emotions you would go through when you're going from initial diagnosis to potentially like serious procedures, and then remission and transitioning back home out of a hospital setting, or for some families transitioning into bereavement or life after the loss of a child. So that's where they really found that psychosocial services were necessary, is during these different stages. And so throughout my whole research, I saw studies of the family, of the parents, of the siblings, and of the child themselves. But one person I never saw studied was the grandparents. And after going to Camp Sunshine, which I think I skipped over the slide entirely accidentally, but so for the last 5 years I've been going to Camp Sunshine, and I've been able to witness, which is a camp for life-threatening illnesses with children, and I do attend the oncology, brain tumor, and bereavement sessions. And now that I've been going to those same sessions for the last 5 summers, I've been able to really connect with families. So for me, that's why I'm choosing this topic, is because I've firsthand witnessed how life-changing psychosocial supports such as Camp Sunshine, which provides respite, as well as emotional group therapy, and then fun intervention. So they do a little bit more of like what a child life would just outside of the hospital setting. And I've witnessed there how like parents telling me that if they hadn't found Camp Sunshine, it would they don't know what they would have done, and what a life-changing experience. And at one of the bereavement sessions, I encountered a grandparent who sort of had like a little bit of a breakdown. I decided to go over and check on her. And when we were talking, she described how she just witnessed her grandchild pass away, and how awful that was to go through that experience. But also she has an adult living child who's now gone through the worst thing in their life. So while a parent just has the burden of their children and their child who passed away, our grandparent has all of their grandchildren as well as their adult siblings who are now going through inarguably the worst thing that could probably happen to a person. So I realized that then, while grandparents are invited to Camp Sunshine, many other environments don't offer any services to grandparents. And she admitted herself, and what I will be studying is that sort of as you see fathers try and put on the brave face, it's really grandparents who even try and be stronger. They want to be there for their children so they don't show any signs of weakness. They try and take care of the kids. They try and be there in the hospital if they need to be, or if they're far away, that causes even more emotional stress because they have a feeling of not doing anything aside from checking in over a phone call. And on top of that, just regular problems that happens with aging. So if you can't move around as much, you feel even more helpless than you would otherwise. So aside from seeing it mentioned once or twice, I found nothing that actually studied them, which is why I decided to make it my goal to really see how else we can help grandparents. So that's why my research questions for my thesis proposal are going to be, are psychosocial services even offered to grandparents? And if so, at what points in time? So was it when their grandchild was first diagnosed, or during the journey of treatments or post-treatment that they found services most helpful, and which ones were those services? So the survey I'm going to try and do this summer, which I'll be finding out in the next week or two if it will be released and happening, is going to be an anonymous online quantitative data research survey that's going to ask grandparents these questions, having them rate on a scale that I haven't determined yet. I'm meeting with someone later this week.
Good.
To see what was most helpful and find a way to rate the services by effectiveness without oversimplifying it, but also not complicating it as well. And then I'm going to follow up with qualitative interviews with about 6 to 10 grandparents to then get, rather than just hard numbers, to get sort of the personalized data. And then what's next, which I didn't finish the slide up because I wasn't entirely sure how to end, but I think I would end it with just describing that I'm hoping out of this thesis proposal to understand more about how grandparents are dealing with these childhood cancer diagnoses, and if they're not being offered services, how can we make sure that they are getting offered services, and what services would they like to have offered.
Excellent. Okay, what did we observe? What's good? What could be improved?
I thought you did like a really good job of like explaining everything. You sound really like passionate about this topic, and especially like trying to like figure out why grandparents aren't really, given services for grandchildren who have like cancer and whatnot. I think it's actually really interesting. So I'm looking forward to like hear what you find out.
Thanks.
I like that you gave like your own personal experience too. Like that shows that you really do care about this, and that you kind of made your own observations about grandparents, and the story that you told about the grandmother. I thought it was really interesting, and it captured my attention.
Yeah, I think like you sounded like you are very knowledgeable about this topic. I was thinking maybe you could like start with Camp Sunshine.
Yeah, I thought I did. I know I didn't, but I thought, oh yeah, that was supposed to be an earlier slide, but I think I just completely skipped over entirely.
Right.
But yeah, that was going to be introduced
Okay.
in the beginning, and I wasn't sure if it should go even before the facts about childhood cancer, or you think
I
open
think so.
with that?
Yeah, I think because
Okay.
if you talk about that, it kind of draws you in.
Okay.
Well,
Right.
I liked the facts too. I just didn't know if it was like too overwhelming of a slide.
Yeah, I didn't
Like,
either on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I should just cut.
I don't think you need an image there.
Yeah, I
I mean,
was
it's
thinking
getting kinda
no
busy.
either. Yeah.
But I think though, for the previous slide with the chart, there should be a citation there. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
What happened? And I think what you start with Camp Sunshine. This is how you got interested in it, and then you go to the facts, right?
Okay.
And then that feels really.
That's what I was like. Yeah.
There, because you said later on, these two children I knew sound like it just so happened to know a lot of people. with
Yeah.
cancer. But it's actually through working through that, so I think that's really strong. I thought the segue to the grandparents was really good, especially the explanation that they have to not only deal with their grandchild with cancer, but their kids who have the kid with cancer. That's really, really strong. I thought the one where you go, can you go to the next slide? It's this one. Go on, keep going. Yeah, that previous slide, see how that's cut off?
Yeah.
So you want to fix
Fix that.
a little bit. And again, that's a pretty full slide there.
Yeah.
And in one of the earlier one, I think you used the word affect when you went effect. Remember,
Okay.
affect is
I'll check. Yeah.
that's a big distinction in social science, and I think you seem to be talking about effects there. Yeah, and you kind of said, see, I think once you get to all the PTSD and all that kind of stuff, the need for these services, that's the time to kind of circle back to Armstrong and Riemann saying that we should only,
Okay.
because remember, one other thing you say is that even if the kids get better from the cancer, they often have these long-range effects that are really, they're going to need some condition. Do you see what I'm saying? There's
Yeah.
a real opportunity to further justify why this is super important. I mean, I think everybody agrees we like a lot of them to go for the cure,
Mm-hmm.
but again, even if it gets cured, there's still this need for all this other stuff there. And I like your way of concluding, right?
Yeah.
I hope this will not only teach me a lot of stuff, but give recommendations for this undervalued thing. All right.